Hey everyone, in today's video we are going to look at endgame grinds for borrowed power. This is something that both World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV do, but the way they go about it is very different. Now, before we get into all that, just so that we are all on the same page, I'm going to define borrowed power. So, borrowed powers, they are essentially abilities and traits that are not permanent. They are only available for the content that they were designed for, which is very different from how most abilities work, where you can use them in, whatever content that you want. Anyways, let's start with World of Warcraft and how it has been handling grinds for borrowed power. So, World of Warcraft has been using borrowed power for entire expansions, which is pretty massive, right? This idea was a solution that Blizzard came up with to help mitigate ability bloat, which can be a problem in an MMO, especially after it's been out for a while and they keep giving you more and more actions every single expansion. So instead of giving players permanent abilities, they give you something to use for an expansion, and when that expansion is over, you lose those abilities, and traits, and whatever else was borrowed. So, my first negative experience with grinding for borrowed power in WoW really hit in Legion. In that expansion, they had an entire system designed around your legendary weapon. So, you would grind for special experience, called artifact power for this expansion, through a variety of content. And you could use that artifact power in a system that was unique to Legion, where you would have a separate UI, and here you would unlock nodes that acted as a secondary way to progress your character. And this was a pretty cool system. It was enjoyable being able to progress your character in this way. The problem is this was a borrowed power system. When the expansion was over, they disabled everything with this feature. The legendary specific ability, all the nodes you unlocked, all that progress. So all of that time, effort, and energy you put into that grind, well, it was pointless in the end. What a great way to make me feel like my time was respected and wisely spent. I mean, you couldn't even use these features in Legion anymore. Blizzard just completely gutted it out of the game. And just to be clear, I really did like Legion. I just hated that the progression grind was made pointless. And of course, in Battle for Azeroth, they introduced a new borrowed power grind, in the way of a necklace called the Heart of Azeroth. And this was very similar to the legendary weapon in Legion. You would gain experience for it through something called, originally enough, Azerite power, and in that way you could increase its item level and add special attributes to the necklace. And the worst part was that this grind had no cap. So essentially, you could grind Azerite power to your heart's content, all day and night. And in fact, if you were a raider, that is exactly what you did. And towards the end of the expansion, they also introduced something known as corruption, as a way to power up your character. It was another grind on top of the necklace, but at least there was a cap to how much you could do each week, which was good, since the worst part about the necklace was the obligation you felt to grind all the time. But of course, none of that mattered, because when BFA was over, corruptions were disabled, all the stuff you did for your necklace was disabled, and you felt like, yet again, you just wasted a bunch of time and energy. Even more so than Legion, since the grind for Azerite power was so much worse. And of course, Shadowlands has its own grinds for power, and I am sure that when 10.0 drops, if history is any indication, that it will all be going away. As I mentioned before, if you were a raider, the grinds for these could be ghoulish. So much time and energy because the difference in power was really that drastic. Someone who put more time in the grind would simply outperform you in every metric. And when it came to raiding, why would you be chosen when someone else would outclass you because they spent a bunch of extra time grinding for power? It was like, you better not get sick and you better not take any time off the game. You know, it may suck when an ability gets pruned, especially if you like that ability, but abilities are basically given to you while you level. These borrowed power progression systems are long time investments, so it's much worse when you dump a bunch of time into a progression system, only to have all of that effort yeeted and deleted. So, if that's how World of Warcraft handles it, then what does Final Fantasy XIV do differently? So, Final Fantasy XIV uses its grind for borrowed power as a separate system from the expansions. They introduced this in Stormblood with content called Eureka, and continued it in Shadowbringers with content called the Bahamut Front. Now, the way it works is these systems are designed for players to get their ultimate weapons for the expansion. Now, if you are a raider coming from World of Warcraft, you may think, well, that's awful. How is that any different? You have to spend a bunch of time grinding to get these weapons. But the developers thought of that and designed it so that really isn't the case. Now, the way that Final Fantasy XIV handles this is, the weapons upgrade in stages that are staggered through patches, and they are always less powerful than the weapons that you will get from the Savage rating of that patch. So, they only become the most powerful weapon well after the final tier of rating has been out, so there's far less pressure to complete them. Anyways, I mentioned Eureka before, and this is essentially a love letter to old school MMOs. Specifically to Final Fantasy XI. Now, the reason this is borrowed power is because the power you gain only applies in Eureka. So when you first enter Eureka, you go into a special zone, start at level 1, and you grind levels by killing enemies and participating in fates. Very similar to how old school MMOs handled their leveling. There is even special gear that have stats that only apply in Eureka. These can take a while to get. Some have very low drop chances, but hey, they will always be useful for you whenever you do Eureka's content. Also, a very nice touch is that some of the gear you get in Eureka is straight out of Final Fantasy XI. As someone who played and loved Final Fantasy XI, it was a pretty amazing touch to see that gear realized in Final Fantasy XIV. It even has an elemental wheel system where you change the element of your attacks and defenses to deal with enemies more effectively. It's basically a game within the game, and I know players who have spent many hours in Eureka. So when you leave the zone, that power doesn't come with you, hence being borrowed. However, when you go back, you get the power back. I think this makes all of the difference, because the effort and time you put into this, it isn't just deleted. You don't feel like you have wasted your time spending hundreds, if not thousands of hours doing this progression. So next up, let's talk about the Bahamut Front, which is very similar to Eureka in that it's an isolated progression system, and it didn't go away when Shadowbringers ended. In the Bahamut Front, you gain rank by participating in something called critical engagements, which are basically these boss encounters that have several mechanics, and you will find out pretty quickly that they can be very challenging. And as you gain more and more rank, you gain access to more features and are able to get further into the zones. There are even special spells and items that are only usable in the Bahamut Front that can completely break the game. You will just see bosses melt when the players use these. And the Bahamut Front even unlocks another progression path after you hit the max rank of 25. It's called Resistance Honors, and that lets you further increase your stats. It will take a very long time if you want to max all of these out. Much like Eureka, it's borrowed because when you leave, you don't take it with you. But when you go back, it's there for you to use again. Yet again, your progress doesn't feel like it's a waste of your time. In an MMORPG, one of the most appealing factors is character growth. Spending a bunch of time progressing your character just to have all that progress deleted, well, that just doesn't feel great. I remembered when I was playing Battle for Azeroth, and I saw that grind for the necklace, I didn't even want to play anymore, because I knew that when the expansion ended, that all the time I spent on that necklace was going to be for nothing. It makes you wonder, everything you did, everything you gave, what was it all for? Spending hundreds, if not thousands of hours on progression, just to have it all removed? That feels really bad. And I think the developers behind Final Fantasy XIV really understood this, which is why the Bahamut Front and Eureka were designed in the way that they were. Your progress is saved. The time and energy you spent actually means something. Anyways, that is all for today. I hope you are all having a great day, and if you enjoyed this video and would like to see more, please consider subscribing. Thank you so much for watching, and take care.